Hello, welcome to Healing with podcast. I am Marissa McDevitt, your host, mindset coach, mentor, and founder of Healing Center. Tired of all the BS? So was I. This podcast is my raw, unfiltered take on life, sharing my personal experiences, lessons, and healing practices that helped me break free from the cycles that no longer serve me. I'm just an average woman who decided to stop settling and start speaking up. Here we dive deep into the messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful realities of life, business, and relationships. No fluff, no judgment, just real talk, real growth, and real transformation. This is a safe space for anyone, women, men, and all the beauties in between. So who's ready to raise their standards, heal, and step into their power? Let's learn, grow, and evolve together. Now tune in and let's talk about it. Addicts, Part 1. A generational pattern I refused to repeat. Addiction runs in families, not because of blood, but because of unhealed trauma. And today, I'm telling you the story of how I watched it destroy everything and how I chose differently. So before I even begin, this episode contains discussions of addiction, substance abuse, domestic violence, and childhood trauma. It may not be suitable for children or for those who are currently in a fragile mental state. So please listen with care. To be clear, this episode is not about shaming anyone. It's about awareness. It's about patterns, and it's about choice. Addiction doesn't always look like rock bottom. Sometimes it looks like prescriptions. Sometimes it looks like weed every single night, every single day. Sometimes it looks like a child learning how to survive inside chaos. I was that child. I grew up inside addiction before I even knew what that word meant. So what brings me to recording this episode? My whole childhood. But really, this past year of watching close friends of mine struggle with drugs and addiction. And not just hard drugs. They're struggling with weed, prescriptions, stimulants. It triggered my childhood watching them. And I realized that addiction doesn't always look like what people think addiction does. I have lived inside addiction. I have walked near it, and I took my own path of choosing differently. I grew up pouring wine into my mother's glass at 7 years old and secretly pouring it into the sink. This episode isn't about addiction fully. It's about survival and the generational pattern I refused to repeat. So I was born into a survival mode. For example, my mother was prescribed Xanax in her early teens. She was on depression meds, bipolar meds, trauma layered on top of trauma, heavy drinking to numb her physical and abuse and emotional abuse. She was bulimic. She had body dysmorphia. My father was an alcoholic, functioning. He loved drugs. He loved the party lifestyle. Violence was huge in our house, screaming and fighting and physical abuse between my parents. Cigarette smoke everywhere, can't escape. And again, filling my mom's wine glasses at 7-year-olds and then secretly pouring it down the drain. So again, addiction isn't just about substance. It's trauma trying to survive. All right, here we go. Let's dive into this. It's crazy because I've had this episode on my whiteboard here for months. And there's easier episodes for me to record that are not so triggering towards my own life, right? I blocked out a lot of my childhood when I was a kid. I didn't remember a lot of things until I started journaling again, until I started doing retreats of my own trauma release. Things started coming back up. And with this past year of losing so many of my friends, not death, thank God, but losing friendships over drugs, losing friends over toxic relationships, losing friends over no accountability, it's time for me to explain why I walk so close to this, and I understand because I've lived it, I've been through it, and I've overcome it. And if I can do that, so can you. My parents both had an interesting upbringing. My mom had very interesting parents. Her mom was very intense, and her dad had, 5 different wives, I think. A lot of kids. So when my mom's parents got divorced, they used my mom, which many parents do these days, as a punching bag for each other. I'm going to hold on to her. I'm going to hold on to her. I'm going to use her against you. I'm going to use her against you. So my mom's stepmother started beating her when my mom was young, in her, 10, 11, 12. My mom was put on Xanax in her teens. Okay? Not only was my mom getting emotionally abused, physically abused, instead of helping her in school or therapist, their option was to put her on Xanax. I'm giving you this background on my mom because I've done the work to forgive her. I've done a lot of healing retreats. I've done a lot of family purging. I've done a lot of family generational releasing to be able to get to this point, but it's still hard for me to talk about. So my mom was put on Xanax in her early teens. She was also bipolar and schizophrenic, but they never really diagnosed her right. She was also depressed. So I know she was on Xanax, which I don't even really know what Xanax is for. Anxiety, maybe. And then she was put on depression medicine. She was bipolar and she was schizophrenic, which is a shit ton of labels for trauma. Tons of trauma that was not ever released. So she started drinking early when she was in her teens. And she was bulimic. So she had a body dysmorphia issue as well. So as you can see, my mom kind of was not in right guidance from the start. Now, my dad's side, I'm not really too sure about his family background. We haven't really talked too much about it, but I will be bringing him on and we will be going live deeper together. But my dad did come from a violent background of heavy metal, drugs, drinking, PCP, lots of psychedelics, weed, alcohol, fighting, because that's the kind of music and vibration he was playing. He was in a heavy metal band. And my parents met when they were in their teens, I think 18 or 17. Fast forward, my dad was always abusive to my mom. Same with her first husband, which was my dad's best friend at the time. They're 16, 17. And my mom, unfortunately, her first husband beat her physically. And my dad would watch that happen and he felt bad for her and ends up dating my mom, marries her, and then he ends up beating her, which I don't understand, but maybe I can get into that once the time comes. So not only were they both drinking prescription drugs, My dad was smoking weed, drinking, doing psychedelic, whatever he was doing. And they were physically abusing each other. So extremely toxic. They both smoked cigarettes, all things. I was born. My earliest childhood memory, I was laying in an apartment and my parents were screaming and fighting. And I just remember we had these two birds, and I remember Birdie. We had these two birds. I don't know what kind of birds they were. The ones with the little rosy cheeks. They're so cute. I had those birds forever. One of them got out. And I remember my dad's heavy metal music playing in the background, but I always, like, from my earliest childhood memory, I just remember them fighting and screaming. I remember going out to play. I had been 2 years old in the apartment. And there used to be 4-leaf clover patches, and I would sit out there because they would be fighting. And it was grounding for me to go out there. Long story short, from what I remember, they were always fighting when they were drinking and whatnot. My childhood, there was more bad memories than good memories. And I blocked a lot of those out as a kid. However, I do try to hold on to the good memories. Because the more I heal from everything, and I've done a lot of work on this, is, two young teenagers, two young adults trying to raise a child when they both have so much trauma, so much mental illness, so much addiction, so much alcohol and drugs and prescriptions and psychosis, and you name it, they had it, on top of trying to survive life. Of course, all this shit's gonna happen, It's a recipe for disaster. So now you know. From the minute I was born into this chaos. I don't know if you can see in the video, but my nose is also always been broken from when I was a little baby because my mom was drunk and she dropped me on the coffee table and it broke my nose. And it grew broken. Yeah, so I grew up begging my mother to roll down the windows in the car because she smoked menthol cigarettes and I couldn't breathe. This was back in the early 90s when you could smoke everywhere, when you could smoke in your house, when you can smoke on the plane, when you can smoke in your car, at the restaurant, it's just like I couldn't get away from it. And back in the day, it was, shut the fuck up, Marissa, if I cried or said anything. So still, to this day, if I smell a cigarette within 5 feet from me, I will ask the person to put it out, leave the area, or just, be very dramatic and be like, ew. What's funny is my parents still smoke to this day. Both of them. We had a roof over our head. We did have food. We went to school. We had each other, me and my little sister. The first 6 years, I remember having really good Christmases. Lots of presents, not too much fighting. It was awesome. We used to go camping up north all the time, go fishing. But then around 7 years old, I remember holidays started getting worse. So that's when I was old enough to realize, my mom was having me fill her wine glasses. This is back in the day. I don't know. I guess they still sell box wine, but she'd have a box of wine on the counter by the kitchen sink, and I would fill up her glass of wine and give it to her. At first I thought that was so cool. And what's funny is I still bartend to this day. Thought it was so cool. You're a kid. It's cool. I get to fill up my mom's wine glass, try a couple sips. It's not good. Give it to her. Then I realized that, when mom has too much to drink, her and dad fight. Or when mom has too much to drink, she falls asleep on the couch with her cigarettes lit. We can't, wake her up because she's just drunk, passed out. So then I figured out that, okay, I'll fill it, then I'll pour it out in the sink. and then I'll fill it and I'll pour it out in the sink and I'll just watch her and I'll keep doing it until she watches me, and then I'm filling it up and then I'll come bring her a glass. Not only was it wine, it's like every few days she would get a box of wine, a case of Keystone Light, and a bottle of Jägermeister. Of course, her and my dad would drink that. My dad mostly drank beer and Jägermeister. My mom drank all three. Again, holidays started getting bad. It went from lots of presents to smaller presents and them just waking up and starting to drink. They would fight with our family who would come over. They would fight with each other. It would just be a lot of screaming. It was a lot of screaming. So you can just imagine, my mom had so much trauma from her childhood, undiagnosed mental illnesses, and an abusive husband, and they're both trying to raise a kid. On top of drinking all their drinking, popping prescription pills because they were prescribed to them, to my mom. It was just a freaking walking disaster, my mom. And my dad, he's a functioning alcoholic who used weed to calm his nerves because he didn't know, the extent to all my mother's mental illnesses and trauma on top of his. And he was also dealing with his own demons. When I was about 11 years old, that's when my mom got a really bad DUI. And that's when everything kind of took a turn in our lives. My mom was a waitress. And my dad was a framer. He built like multi-million-dollar homes, framed them, and did all the blueprints and all the stuff. So my dad had a good job. My mom was a waitress, and I remember like she would buy the food and take us to our school events and pay for our school events like cheerleading and horses and all the things. And my dad would pay for like the main bills and stuff. But when my mom got this DUI, she was drinking at work. Was so drunk that she left her work and she ran into multiple cars because she was so wasted and drove down the road with 3 tires. So, of course, she was pulled over. She went to jail for a while. And then, the car was damaged. She got a breathalyzer put in the car. She was on probation. And that's when my dad had to start working more than he already was. So one, my dad was in and out of jail my whole life. So I remember calling the cops on my dad when I was 6 or 7 because he was beating my mom in front of us. And my mom would scream, call 911. So we would grab the phone. That was the house phone back then because they didn't have cell phones. And we would have to call 911. So I was probably calling the cops on my dad once or twice a month from when I was like 6 to 12. So my dad was in jail a lot. Okay, so not only was my dad in and out of jail, screaming and fighting every weekend when they would drink, then my mom loses her job, gets a breathalyzer. My dad has to start working more. And my mom, instead of getting help, she started drinking more. She started popping more pills, and she never got a job again. She just went into this extreme depression and she never went to her bedroom anymore. She slept on the couch, would talk on the phone to her friend, and it was just drinking and fighting with my dad every single day. My dad was working 7 days a week, trying to keep the house going. He would come home, he would have to clean, he would cook because my mom wasn't doing anything. I remember I was cleaning and cooking the best I could for my little sister and myself. I remember one of our last Christmases, we didn't have any money for Christmas presents, and so I went to the dollar store and I stole money there was money on the counter. I don't know whose money it was, my dad's obviously. And I went to the dollar store and I got a couple gifts and I wrapped them myself and I put them under the tree for my sister. So she would have something to open up for Christmas. Because my mom was drunk and my dad was high. So my dad is working 7 days a week, coming home, cooking, cleaning, trying to take us kids to school because my mom's not doing anything. For a while, my mom was still taking us to school, but she had a breathalyzer in her car, and she would make me and my little sister blow into the breathalyzer to keep the car running or to start the car because she couldn't stop drinking. And then that just got so bad that she couldn't even drive anymore. So my dad needed stuff to stay awake, so someone introduced him to speed, which is an amphetamine. And my dad started taking speed. And after a while, it wasn't doing enough, so someone introduced him to crystal meth. Now my mom is completely depressed, on tons of pills, drinking. My dad is extremely overwhelmed, angry, smoking meth, still working 7 days a week, but now he's tweaking. It starts to get bad. My dad starts losing his contracts for work. He still we had a place up in northern Arizona in the cabin, and we were gonna have horses and all the things, and we were on a good track, but because everything was happening and my dad started smoking meth and my mom was just trying to get him off of it, but dealing with her own things, it was so bad. He ended up losing that contract too, so we lost the cabin up north. My mom fought my dad on the meth she made a game out of it, which I didn't know that normal people didn't do this. She would hand me and my friend a hammer, and she would say, okay, this is what a meth pipe looks like. She would find a meth pipe, my dad's meth pipe, and she would say, if you see this, go around the house. If you see any, grab them, go outside and bust them with the hammer. So me and my friend would go around the house, and we would find them all kinds underneath the coffee table taped, in the bathroom taped. So if you're listening to this and someone's smoking crack or meth, they probably have them taped underneath your coffee tables, underneath the bathroom, underneath in the toilet. Lift up the toilet underneath that. Like, I knew all this stuff when I was 10 years old. Well, eventually, couldn't beat him, so she joined him. And she started smoking meth. And that was it. We lost everything. I remember my dad waking me up in the middle of the night and grabbing me and taking me to the entertainment center and saying, kid, tell your mother this entertainment center is moving. Tell her it's moving. And, I would say, no, Dad, it's not moving. And it's not moving. And he would get me because he knew that I was sane. My kid's not going to lie to me. And then they would fight. And there was this one time my dad woke me up in the middle of the night. And he was plucking all his hairs out. His face, putting them on the bathroom sink. And he would say, look, they're moving. The hairs, they're moving. And after a while, it's like, how many times are you going to wake me up? So I would just say, yeah, Dad, they're moving. And then he would say, see, they're fucking moving. And freak, whatever, tweaking. I remember I would come home from school and the whole house would be torn apart. Like the blinds would be off the windows. And the house was like literally like someone ransacked it. And then the next day I would go to school and I would come home and everything was put back better than ever before. That is just meth addicts. Tweakers. Anyways, eventually we lost everything. I'm not going to get into too much of it in my childhood because still just so much crazy stuff. We lost everything. My mom started selling all my dad's stuff because she didn't have any money, and my dad was in jail for months at a time now for beating her and meth, and they were planting meth on each other and calling the cops. It got nasty. My dad got out of jail, and I just remember my bedroom window was open and came out of my bedroom into the living room, and my dad was standing there over my mother, hovering. And my mom was on the couch, passed out, drunk with her boyfriend at the time, in my dad's house with all my dad's stuff. I walked in to the living room, and my dad had a bat in his hand, and he was going to kill her. And he had it above his head, like he was going to beat her to death. Him, her, and this guy she was with. And I just looked at my dad, and my dad caught a glimpse of me standing there and turned and looked at me. And his eyes were the most evilest. They're black. He was completely demonic. Completely demonized. There was no soul in my dad's body at that point. He was possessed. And I just looked at him and I started crying, and I just shook my head, no. Like, don't do it. And my dad looked at me, and he looked at them, and he looked at me, and he looked at them, and he looked at me. And he put the bat down, and we walked into my bedroom together, and he said, pack up your stuff. I'll be here in the morning to pick you up. And I just remember crying, and my dad climbed out my bedroom window, and I don't know where he went. But the next day, my dad came with his truck. It was like a little S10 truck, tiny truck, and he packed up his whatever tools my dad had left from my mom selling, and she's screaming, "You can't be here! I'm gonna call the cops." And my dad said, "Kid, you got your bags packed?" And I said, "Yep." And I was like 12, I think. 12 or 13, yeah. No, I was 12. And I said, "Yes, Dad." And he put my bag in the truck, and he had a little trailer, and we loaded up my little Predator 90 quad, and we drove to Wisconsin that day. And my dad quit meth that day, cold turkey. Never touched it again. And we drove from Arizona all the way to Wisconsin. And I was happy to be with my dad. My mom called the cops and said that he kidnapped me and all things. And even though I begged to be with my dad, and I told the judge and I told the police I wanted to be with my dad, they still made him bring me back to Arizona. So I had to go back to Arizona. That's when my mom kidnapped me to Texas with the same guy she was selling me to. Long story short, I ended up running away multiple times in Texas. Finally convinced them to bring me back home to Arizona. It's a whole nother fucking episode, I guess. Then I was in and out of group homes. Just straight survival mode. My mom ended up going with another guy, and everything was gone. Everything my dad ever worked for, my mom ever worked for, was gone. We lost everything. So a bunch of unhealed trauma mixed with substances creates generational destruction. Talk about a fucking shit show, eh? Woo! That was a little emotional for me. Sorry about that. This part is about my own path into addiction, and you can just imagine, everything I seen as a kid, watching my parents with being, addicts, going through what I had to go through. Clearly, I'm going to be in the same damn path as them, right? I myself started drinking heavily around 15, 16, 17 years old. I got alcohol poisoning twice before I was even 18. Oh, I smoked a lot of weed to numb all my traumas, lots of weed. Constantly living in unstable homes. I caught a felony before I was 18. Started doing psychedelics at 19. Eventually, after all the bullshit went down, my dad was able to fight for me and got a lawyer, and was able to fight for me to get back to Wisconsin with him. Especially after they found out my mom was selling me and all the fucking things, and I wasn't even in school. Fast forward, I moved with my dad, happy, but full of shit. Holy moly, I was full of shit. I was full of trauma. Tons of trauma. Didn't know how to release it. Anger, trauma, just a fucking hot-headed teenager kid. And my dad was barely surviving, was clean off drugs, but drinking heavily and just working every day. He didn't know what to do. He was trying. He also didn't know how to release his emotions or all of the things. So in Wisconsin, you're allowed to drink with your parents at the bar before they're 18. I know, it's bizarre, right? It's so much fun. So I remember going to the bar with my dad every week. Every Sunday, we would go watch the Packer games. I learned how to drive stick shift to pick my dad up from the bar because my dad couldn't drive home because he was drunk. So I would, he taught me how to drive stick shift on the way home from the bar because he was drunk and he couldn't drive. We're just a freaking family full of drama. Yeah. Long story short, I was fighting a lot at school, got expelled. I was drinking a lot. So much that I got alcohol poisoning twice before I was 18. I caught a felony at 17. Just a shit show. Just a trauma-filled shit show is what was going on. I had choices to make. I seen everyone around me drinking, so I drank. I threw tons of parties. I introduced a lot of my friends to weed and alcohol because that's all I knew. And that's what I thought life was about, partying and doing adult stuff. Not going to school, or going to school and skipping school, or going to school and drinking all night. And then, it was just a shit show. My dad, he was surviving. He didn't know how to handle a teenager kid, let alone freaking his own shit. I don't know who it was, but luckily I was introduced to psychedelics. And I always wanted to take mushrooms. And I remember I bought them off a friend, and I came home, and I was living with my friend, and 2/8 of mushrooms. I split them up, and I put the orange juice in a glass next to the side. I put the movie Avatar on, and I called my girlfriend that I was living with, my best friend. I said, "We're going to do mushrooms when you get home tonight." She's like, "I have to work tomorrow." I'm like, "Don't worry, they'll be wear off in a few hours." Yeah, that wasn't the case. Talk about a hot mess. The psychedelics, this is the beautiful thing about psychedelics. It's a tool. And psychedelics are not made for everybody. Absolutely not. People who are schizophrenic, bipolar, psychosis, any mental illnesses, psychedelics is not for you. There are centers, there are resources and actual centers that you can go to that they do microdosing psychedelics and MDMA and ketamine to help people with trauma and mental illnesses, but that is in a setting watched with specific doctors and all the things. So everything I'm telling you, I do not recommend you doing unless you do it with a doctor, because I'm not a doctor. This is just my life experience and how I healed my own trauma and my own addictions. That's not saying go out and do this stuff, okay? Because this is not for everyone. When I was younger, I thought psychedelics was the answer. I thought everyone should do it. Doesn't matter if you have an illness. I was like, you have a mental illness, you need to do the psychedelics. That's not the case. Okay, I've done this for many, many, many years, and I've watched people who have had mental illnesses try psychedelics and go to where they can't return. So please understand that. For me, psychedelics brought me into my spiritual awakening. Okay, psychedelics made me sit back and look at my whole life, day to day, chapter to chapter. All right. I went from drinking constantly and smoking weed to doing a few mushroom ceremonies at my house, tripping, going out in nature, and it brings up all of that trauma that I was holding on to, all those emotions, and I had to face them and I had to release them, and that got me off of drinking. So when I was 19 years old, I quit drinking, and that was the time I started doing psychedelics. I quit drinking. I met my first love of my life, boyfriend. I wanted to be a better person for him. I wanted to be a better person for myself. So I started getting into fitness, and I started detoxing, and I started rebuilding my life. All right. I slowly reduced the substances. Like, I quit drinking, but I was still smoking a lot of weed, and I was doing mushrooms quite often, maybe a few times a month. I was definitely doing MDMA a few times a month as well, which is called Molly. That really started to help me release, open up, and evolve into the person I am today. So the psychedelics made me face my emotions that I didn't want to face, that made me see the world in a different perspective. It made me really look inside myself instead of blaming everything else around me, right? All this anger and all the things. It taught me to take accountability for within myself, my actions. And when I started doing MDMA and ecstasy, that is a beautiful, heart-opening medicine. And that helped me so much. It also helped my dad, which will be another episode. But it helped me open my heart again when I was so closed off because I was so hurt and I was so full of trauma from my childhood and upbringing. And I started going to music festivals, and Plur, Peace, Love, Unity, Respect was huge back in the 90s, all the Candies kids, and that's what we used to do in early 2000s. And from there, it's only been an up and an up and an up and an up. It took a lot of watching people around me destroy their lives on drugs. It's for me to not take that path, which I was this close to taking that path, right? Luckily, I had so much of an awareness that I never touched cocaine in my entire life. I've never done crack. I've never done meth. I've never done any hard drugs like that. I've only done psychedelics. I've only done MDMA and ecstasy, and weed, and I quit smoking weed at like 22, 21 years old. I quit drinking heavily at 20, and I worked for a company called Dance Safe, which is a nonprofit organization, harm reduction, and I went through 6 months of schooling on drugs and psychedelics and learning to be seizure certified and awareness. And I would go to music festivals and I would teach people about drugs, and I would educate people about drugs, and we would have safe spaces for people who were on drugs to come to us, and we would help them. And I learned so much for so many years, and that's really what helped me through my journey. And having mentors, different mentors throughout my life. Even as a child, I was in and out of group homes. I was in and out of other people's homes to run away from my parents, which is another episode, I guess. This all ties into there was so many opportunities for me to do cocaine, for me to smoke the crack pipe, watching everybody else smoke the crack, for, choosing heroin. There was friends that were on heroin. There was friends that were snorting pills. I didn't do any of that because I knew what a meth pipe looked like. I knew what a crack pipe looked like. I knew what pills were because my mom were on them. Okay, so I had this knowledge at a very young age. And even though I was a train wreck as a teenager kid and I was drinking and doing, weed, I still knew what drugs to do and what drugs not to do. And that is one thing I love my dad for, as well, as because even when I was a shit show as a kid, he always says, don't do meth, don't do crack, don't do whatever. Because he's like, I've been through that and you know what happened, kid. So I didn't escape addiction because I was stronger. I escaped because I was aware. I became aware of the different types of what was going on. Okay? So the hard truth about acceptable drugs, like being dependent on weed, being prescribed to pills, street versions of the pills. I watched my friends lose their jobs, their sanity, and their stability. I'm watching good people lose themselves all the time. I have tried to help so many people get off hard drugs. I've helped people detox from pills. I've helped people get off hard drugs. Some I could help and some I couldn't. Watching people's personalities changed constantly. Why do people smoke weed? Some might say, oh, because they have pain. But that's true, right? Medical marijuana, medical marijuana. Absolutely. So you don't have to take the hydrocodones and the oxycontins and all the things. But other people smoke weed to what? Calm themselves down. Get out of their head, relax. They had a long day at work. They need to smoke some weed. What I see all around me is people use weed to block out their emotions. People use weed to escape. People use weed as a complete dependency. Let me give you an example here first. Myself. Why did I start smoking weed at 12? I started smoking weed at 12, one, because I thought it was cool. Okay, everybody, if anybody's smoking weed when they're younger, it's because they think it's cool. All right, because, also I was best friends with the cartel kids, so they got an abundance amount of weed, and that's where I learned how to smoke it, roll it, sell it when I was 12. Why did I start smoking weed? I smoked weed, one, I thought it was cool. Two, I realized, wow, if I smoke weed, I forget about all the problems going on in my life. I forget about my mom and dad fighting. I forget about the guy my mom's selling me to. I forget about the stress I'm living in. I'm just going to go smoke some weed at the park and chill. I'm escaping. I'm chill. Right? That's maybe how we all start. I started smoking weed when I quit drinking. When I quit drinking, I needed something. So I started smoking weed. Why was I drinking all the time? To escape. To escape my emotions, my feelings, stress, to relax. Well, I'm not drinking anymore, so I gotta smoke weed. Why am I smoking weed? To chill, to relax. And then I quit smoking and I quit drinking. And that was for a little while, and that was awesome. But let me give you some examples on dependency of weed. My friend, old friend, she would wake up, smoke weed. She couldn't eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner unless she smoked before. On her little lunch breaks, she was smoking weed in the car. When people would go have a cigarette break, she was going out to have a weed break. She would come home, she would smoke it away. That is dependency. I know people who wake up and they smoke weed, they go to work, they come home, they smoke weed, and they don't even talk to each other. All they do is sit in the garage and smoke weed and watch entertainment on TV. They don't even have conversations. Prescriptions. Adderall. Do you guys know what Adderall is? We're going to get into that soon in the next episode. But it's an amphetamine, you guys. It's speed. Adderall is an amphetamine. And the fact that it's prescribed to all these kids at 12 years old, 8 years old even, is insanity. Hydrocodones, oxycontins, all those things are prescribed. I don't even know what the hell they prescribe them to you for, like oxycontins. I don't know what those are prescribed to you for, but my ex, who I was with for 4 years, he was addicted to smoking oxycontins. I didn't even know you could do that. You can. He learned how to do that in Hawaii when he lived in Hawaii because everybody was smoking meth. But the guys he was living with were smoking oxycontins. So when I met him, he was addicted to cocaine, smoking oxys, and he smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Yeah, I stopped that right away. I got him off the cigarettes, got him onto vaping. 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Like, what the front door? Talk about my freaking parents. The cocaine was a little bit hard, but eventually he got off the cocaine, and he never touched pills when he was with me because that was an absolute no. Street versions. So even for myself, right, I started using Adderall here and there. And when we went to Mexico, we bought Adderall from the pharmacy because you can buy Adderall from the pharmacy. That is not Adderall, you guys. I don't even know what that is, okay? That made me feel really weird, so I quit taking it. And meanwhile, I would take Adderall like once a month or once every 2 months to be focused on something. And still it made me feel weird, so I didn't do it. I'd never done pills. I don't like pills. They freak me out. But when you're prescribed this stuff from the doctor, like my mom, Xanax, and bipolar medicine and all the things, you think it's okay because the doctor prescribed. Addiction doesn't care how you start. It only cares that you keep escaping yourself. For some people, medications is necessary and life-saving. But when trauma is untreated, substances can become coping mechanisms instead of support tools. Psychedelics. My truth on psychedelics. So they helped me process tons of trauma. Tons. Still to this day, if I take psychedelics, which is a few times a year, I still am releasing and seeing trauma from generations. They opened emotional awareness within myself. But again, they're not for everyone. Another thing about psychedelics. I do not believe that you need substances to heal. So all of this episode, please do not take away like, oh my God, I gotta go do psychedelics, or oh my God, I gotta do this. You don't need anything to heal from your traumas. There are so many other ways without drugs to heal and do work to heal your traumas, and we're going to talk about it. So again, what healed me wasn't the substance. It was the awareness it forced me to face. We are entering a time where consciousness is rising. Healing is accessible. Therapy, coaching, breath work, somatic work. We have all of our tools our parents didn't have. This generation doesn't have to numb to survive like we had to. So addiction is trauma. Addiction is avoidance. Addiction is pain with language. You are not your parents. You are not doomed by your bloodline. And you can break the cycles like I have. So if you are listening and you are using substances to cope, I see you. If you're watching someone you love disappear into addiction, I see you. You are not powerless, but you cannot heal someone who refuses to look at themselves. So part 2 will be all about loving someone who doesn't want to be helped. If this episode resonated with you, you do not have to heal alone. Inside my soul alignment coaching containers, we work on emotional regulation, breaking generational cycles, rewiring survival patterns, somatic and spiritual healing, conscious decision making. So you can apply for my one-on-one mentorship, which is a 90-day program. You can join my 6-month soul alignment program, which is launching in a few weeks. And all of this will be in a link in the bio. Healing is not about perfection. It's about awareness. If this episode moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a review. Drop it in the comments. Comment below. Break the cycle if you're ready to choose differently like I have.